When I first moved to Chicago, I had no detailed conception of the city besides visiting as a tourist. From my very first day here, I was told to avoid the South Side, even while already living in it. I grew up in a white upper middle class family in the suburbs of various small cities around the US. Brighton, Michigan, Suamico, Wisconsin, Spanish Fort, Alabama, pretty much all of them filled with people who were broadly similar to me. I was taught in words to understand the histories and experiences of people who were different from me and had different backgrounds from mine, but because I had very little interaction with people who were different from me, my understanding of those people was formed largely just based on what I had been told. And as a result of that, it took on stereotypes and assumptions. I visited Chicago a number of times as a child, doing the usual things that tourists do, downtown hotels, museums, restaurants, and so on. But it wasn't until college that I actually moved here, attending the Illinois Institute of Technology in Bronzeville. At IIT, every new student was assigned what the university called a peer mentor, another student who was a year or two ahead of us and would help guide us through our first year there. On my first day at IIT, my peer mentor gathered her group of mentees in a classroom for a discussion about our campus and the neighborhoods around it. Up on a whiteboard, she drew a map of campus, bounded by 30th Street, 35th Street, Michigan Avenue, and the Dan Ryan. And slowly, along each edge, she began marking off X's, starting with the southern edge, saying, don't go here, don't go here. Really, it's best just to stay on campus. Throughout my time at IIT, voices of authority suggested that perhaps the university was best left to itself, an island of calm in an implied sea of chaos. A large mural outside our admissions office showed a map of the city with IIT as the southern terminus of the Green Line. No notable attractions beyond it. The phrase, don't go south of 35th Street, was common among students and staff alike. And I learned over time that it had been passed down for decades. Initially, my reaction to all of this was born of contrarianism. I was living in this big international city for the first time. I distrusted the authority of a student who had just a year or two on me. And I wanted to get out and explore, even if it meant some sort of vaguely defined danger to myself. So I started walking and biking around Bronzeville, often taking my camera with me and taking photos of things like vacant buildings and alleys out of a misguided, extractive sense of adventure. I didn't realize at the time that the reason that I was focusing on these things like vacant buildings and alleys was because I wasn't really rebelling against what I had been told about Bronzeville. I was still walking around with those stereotypes lodged in the back of my head. My brain focused in on these things because despite the fact that I thought I was rebelling against the advice I was given, that advice dominated how I saw the neighborhood around me. I saw these things like vacant buildings and alleys, and I focused in on them so intently because it's what I expected. I expected decay and I expected danger, and I looked out over my shoulder for that decay and that danger. I remember specifically one day standing near the corner of Pershing and Michigan, taking a photo of a house, when somebody pulled up beside me in a car, got out, and quickly started walking towards me. And in that moment, I thought, oh my God, I am going to get mugged, I'm going to get beaten, I'm going to get murdered, all of these things that people have told me are going to happen to me on the South Side. Today's the day. But instead, I met Brother Hall, a longtime Bronzeville local, who knew about the history of the house and cared about it, and was so excited to see somebody taking a photo of it that he wanted to stop and share in that excitement. He gave me his card with his number, told me I should talk to Harold Lucas, a local historian, and he became my first acquaintance in Bronzeville who was unaffiliated with the university and didn't repeat that same line about don't go south of 35th Street. Over time, I started taking buses back and forth, sitting down in restaurants and cafes like Sip and Savor on 43rd and Currency Exchange Cafe on Garfield, first overhearing conversations and later getting to know people who lived across the broad South Side and getting a fuller picture of the broad South Side. And that picture didn't match what I had been told. I came to realize that the boundaries that had been handed to me were highly racialized, and that the people setting and repeating those boundaries largely had little to no experience with the areas that they were talking about. And I came to realize that the broad South Side has a great diversity of things like race, class, built environment, and more, all of which got wiped away by this racialized shorthand of stay away. It feels silly in retrospect to have had to learn what I did. And to be honest, it feels shameful. But the initial advice that somebody's given about a new place when they move there can have a huge impact on how they view that place, and it did for me. It took a long process of unlearning to truly understand that there's nowhere on the South Side, nowhere in Chicago, that bullets are just flying around all day long, or that you're in significant physical danger just like standing around or walking around or going into a shop. I've become a better Chicagoan by learning from people whose experiences are different from mine, whose backgrounds are different from mine, whose depth of experience in their neighborhood or in this city is different from mine. And in going to different neighborhoods where these people live and where I've learned from them. And that goes not just for racially integrated and economically stable neighborhoods like Hyde Park or Beverly. It also goes for neighborhoods that draw headlines for things like violence and disinvestment, like Englewood and Roseland. Every single one of them is a community with block clubs, church groups, organizers, people who care very deeply about the place that they live and call home. And more than that even, people who are just ordinary, normal people doing ordinary, normal things like anywhere else in the city. I've lived in Chicago now for over 7 years. First renting in various near South Side neighborhoods like Bronzeville, Bridgeport, and Kenwood while learning more about the city and its neighborhoods. And eventually I decided that I wanted to settle in the neighborhood of Pullman on the far South Side. I chose Pullman because it's meaningfully socioeconomically diverse, it has a ton of really active community organizations, and it's physically beautiful too. I moved there last year and I've been really happy there. When I leave the house, I still often bring my camera with me and take photos of things that I see. But the things that I photograph are different than the vacant buildings and the alleyways that I once photographed. I photograph things like a mural painted by a neighborhood group, or an apartment complex where tenants organized against an abusive landlord. These things are a reflection of how I see the city differently than I once did, and how I have a fuller picture of the city than I once did. I can imagine a version of myself that had heeded the initial advice that I was given, fled to the North Side the first chance I got, and continued to believe what I was told about the South Side. I see him reflected in people whose backgrounds are like mine who did just that, and who continue to repeat that line, don't go south of 35th, or don't go south of wherever their line happens to be. Instead, I stayed on the South Side. I eventually settled on the South Side, and I'm in a neighborhood where I can learn from people whose experiences and backgrounds are different from me, and I can continue to learn and unlearn from people unlike me for the rest of my life. And I'm very glad, personally, that that's the path that I ended up on.